So, as promised, joined by Carol Malone and Stig Abell. Thank you both for joining us. What was our first one? We were going to have a look at the Mirror, first of all, weren't we? The £10 million goodbye.
Yeah, I think people are upset. I mean, although it's not a state funeral, technically, it is, in effect. And they're saying it's going to cost 10 million quid and the security bill is going to be huge. And I think people are upset at the fact that they're saying the country is skint, and so if we're skint, how can we afford to pay this amount of money? But as we were just saying now, in the scheme of things, with the debt we have, which I can't remember, £10 million, where it seems a lot, isn't really. It's not going to make a difference to the country, is it?
Well, they're not going to use it. They're not going to, if they don't have this funeral, the way the government budgeting works, they're not going to take this money and put it into a hospital. They're not going to put it into a school. It's just going to be frittered away somewhere else. I mean, it's the obvious route, I suppose, for the story to go, particularly if you're a left-leaning paper like the Mirror and the Guardian, where you've already had the sort of outpourings of respect. And the Guardian and the Mirror, actually, yesterday were very much on the grounds that she was a statesman and it was worthy of respect. We've had that now, and now if we're not politically aligned with Margaret Thatcher, starting to look at how we pay for, how we actually start to express the nation's view on her is where the story will naturally tend. And of course, we don't really know what will happen. No one would have really predicted the response to Princess Diana when she died. The funeral was quite a surprise to people when it actually happened. The roses being thrown, the sort of wailing and gnashing of teeth that took place came as a bit of a surprise. So it's quite difficult to see what will actually happen on the day, because when something massive like this happens, a state-style funeral, all sorts of things start to bubble up to the surface.
In human lives, in general, in family lives, end of life is hard to predict, isn't it? It's hard to know exactly how that moment will affect the next few
weeks. It would be shocking, I think, if this funeral was interrupted by riots. You know, we can't forget. You know, she will have her son and daughter there. She will have her grandchildren there. You know, lots of her family, people who loved her, friends. To have their moment when they want to pay their last respects, never mind the rest of the nation, for those people, if it is disrupted by riots, it will be appalling. And
well, you say disrupted by riots. Do we or don't we think there'll be riots? Or do you think the cameras will just find the odd stone?
Stig doesn't think there's going to be riots. Yeah. I think if the media continues the way it's going, there may well be riots, because we're stoking up a lot of ill feeling, and that's what that's what a lot of it is about now. That we're seeing a lot of very angry people, and people are angry at the cost of this, because they're saying, if you know, you're right that the money, the £10 million, would not be spent on a hospital, it would not be spent getting people jobs, but people are saying, you know, we're broke, why are we doing this? But
I don't think there'll be riots because
we were drawn to this, weren't we, with the Daily Mail?
Yeah, the flames of hate, and you know these kids, young guys and women here will not have actually experienced life under Margaret Thatcher. I don't feel, and I could be completely wrong about this, that there will be this groundswell of significantly large numbers of people gathering together. If you look at the viewing figures about last night on all the major networks ran long documentaries about them, no one watched them. You know, people in Fleet Street who are all of a certain age, Margaret Thatcher was one of the most significant people in their lives. If you were the editor of the Mail, if you're the editor of the Guardian, the Independent, Margaret Thatcher would have been probably one of the 10 most important people in your life as you were a professional person growing up as a journalist. Outside of that world, I just wonder whether people under the age of 30 will have had no experience of it. There'll be a chance to get together and shout a little bit, as you're seeing in Bristol and you're seeing in Glasgow. But at the moment, that to me looks like pockets of people gathering together to express a view about a historically, to a certain constituency of people, unpopular person, and no more than that.
And it's interesting, you have to wonder, you know, how big this groundswell of unpopularity is, because The Sun today have done a poll, and they're saying that, you know, 1 in 4 people have said she is the most popular Prime Minister since World War II. And it is interesting that yesterday and today, lots of Labour grandees, lots of ex-Labour ministers were. Roy Hattersley, I think, said there were 2 politicians that changed the face of this century. Clement Attlee was one, and she was another. And he said, even though I didn't agree with a single thing she did or a single thing she said, you could not escape the fact she was a political giant and that she was a conviction politician. She believed everything she did. It might not have been popular, but she did it because she believed it. I wonder how many politicians we could say about that today.
And actually, she was elected 3 times because she did the one thing that Conservatives have never managed to do since, which is to mobilise people in all classes. I mean, we both come from, we were talking about this before, we come from working class families who voted for Thatcher some of the time. And David Cameron, who is perceived
from the south, I take it.
No, from the middle.
I'm from the north. I'm from Newcastle. So you know, it was a Labour heartland, and there were people and I was a young reporter, and people voted for Thatcher once in the north. They voted for her in '79 because the country was a mess. You know, I remember my father, I was 20, and I said to him, he told me he'd voted for Thatcher, and I said, what? You know, as an idea. I said, what? And he just said, she's a leader, the country's in a mess, we need to get out of the mess. He said, so I voted, and I think a lot of people did that at the time.
Which is a cycle of charismatic leadership, isn't it?
Exactly. And that's what we're seeing now. You know, the independents say it's a nation disunited in mourning, but it's a nation united in a fervent reaction to a person and an ideal. I mean, whatever you think about Thatcher's philosophies, they were definable. They were campaignable, and therefore people felt very strongly about it.
We mustn't forget she did appeal to a lot of ordinary people. And when she got in '79, she got in by a huge majority of 11%. Voted for by skilled workers, and also a massive swing of 9% by unskilled workers. They were ordinary people, and they voted for her. That was the time the one and only time my dad voted for her. So we can't pretend that the people who voted for her were middle class and aristos. They weren't. They were working people.
But we also can't pretend that it was a totally smooth 11.5 years of popularity.
It was absolutely not smooth.
Seriously low points.
It was not smooth. And you know, when you look at those ugly scenes on the streets now, those kids who were demonstrating today have never seen scenes like that in this country. That's what makes me a bit cross about that, because they never lived through that, and a lot of people in this country did. She decimated communities. There was no question about that. But I get cross that someone has died, and whether you loved her or hated her, and I know that phrase has been overused today, she's dead, and I hate the kind of disrespect of anyone who's died. I don't like it.
I kind of agree. The one thing I do quite like about this is it is a moment where you start reflecting on major political ideals, and she did that with what she did, and you can actually have that, and you see it in all the papers, a discussion of what she did in the city, what she did with housing. You know, are we suffering from a housing shortage? Because part of the right to buy policy she put in meant people could own houses for the first time, but she stopped widespread house building, and we're now living with the consequences of that now. So I think it's a moment for big ideas. But you're right, its passions ran high throughout the 11 years, and some of the things she did will linger in communities forever. But I just wonder, when you get to a funeral, a big state occasion, where the majority of people who are attending it, one would imagine, will be in their 40s, 50s, 60s and 70s, whether you might just see a moment of people reflecting on the good and the bad.
Do we also wonder how much of this legacy is just a hangover of 30 years ago, and how much of it is genuine? We've got these people who are nursing terrible animosity, and that's led to these sort of ridiculous parties. At the same time, we've got members of the Tory party crying tears over the loss of the greatest leader. The same people that clubbed together to kick her out when they realised it wasn't working anymore.
And let's face it, we've had both Labour and Tory in since then, and they've all had the chance to change what's gone on, and they haven't actually. And we're in a bigger mess now than we were back then. So I don't think it's a bit rich for them to be blaming her for what has happened. I saw Ken Livingstone on the telly the other night talking about the policy of buying houses, and he was saying how terrible this was, and I was thinking, where I lived in the northeast, it was the greatest thing ever to be allowed to buy your council house, because ordinary working people had the chance to buy a house that they could leave to their children. It was a legacy for their children, and they were proud if they could scrape the money together.
And the Guardian did a poll today, and it was 50%. The policy that most resounded and resonated from Margaret Thatcher was that policy, and 50% of people thought it was.
And 2 million people bought their houses, and those of the people who bought those houses today, they have some money because of that. So that can't be bad.
Should we take a look at how the Independent has? I say that with great confidence, but
we can describe it.
You've lost control of that again.
The old phrase "talk amongst yourselves" just springs to mind.
There we go.
We could talk about
what's interesting with this, of course, is how much prominence that graffiti gets. It's the first thing you see.
Yeah, and it goes back to your point, which I think is really important, that you can understate some of the strength of feeling in this, and how much of it's genuine, how much is it synthetic is hard to say, but. If you read some of the pieces, people like Jerry Adams, the Union guys, when they write about it's visceral. It's this visceral hatred. If you were from a mining community, and you felt that she just threw these guys to the wolves, and she was single-minded in her ideals. And her ideals, if you weren't on her side, she was perfectly happy for a sort of Darwinistic approach to take place. If you weren't part of the future...
Well, she had a problem, didn't she, with underachievers? She didn't really understand people who weren't overachievers like herself.
And the Conservative Party is still trying to tap into that. That's why they go for the strivers versus the shirkers. You know, what David Cameron wants to achieve and what George Osborne wanted to achieve is that Thatcher magic, which was being able to appeal to people who wanted to work hard. And the problem that they have is that Margaret Thatcher was a grocer's daughter from Grantham, and so she could talk about working hard and people would kind of buy it.
Yeah, they listened to it, yeah.
Even though you can overstate that. With Cameron, you see someone with from a rich background, Osborne, exactly the same thing.
Cameron had a job.
But we were saying...
In the media. In the media, it's not like us, it's not a proper job.
We were saying that's why her Tory party was more acceptable than the current Tory party, because people did see, ordinary people could relate to her. They cannot relate.
But how extraordinary that cabinet was. 22 public school boys using cricketing analogies when they resign, and then this grocer's daughter in the middle, handbagging them if they... Well, the myth was she handbagged them if they raised their voices, but in fact, they had quite noisy debates. I mean, they all enjoyed a good argument. Nigel Lawson, Geoffrey Howe, these sort of people.
Yeah, and the way they talk about her now, I mean, that's why we're getting this
They were still talking with respect about her, weren't they?
Were.
Even the ones who stabbed her in the back. I mean, Geoffrey Howe, after making that speech, it was, you know, that was terminal for her. But even, I was watching him last night, and he spoke with still enormous respect for her.
Yeah, and a lot of the issues we're getting out of the pantomime villain. Have you seen that Ding Dong, The Witch is Dead might go into the top 40 because it's being voted on, it's being bought on iTunes as a way of sort of campaigning. It actually gets rather silly. And
that's not. I don't think that's. I think that is actually hideous. When we were talking about this before. There's an inherent sexism with this. You know, the witch is dead, the bitch is dead. You know, the hag. They would not talk about any male politician in those terms. But because it's a woman, I don't know whether that's people are still resentful that a woman ran the country. I don't know what it is, but I know that I've never heard.
No, there is this venom that societies have for women, isn't it?
Women,
it's almost
in
like
power.
Dutch traitors having their heads shaved when the Second World War ended it. They turned on the women who had to...
And yet, if you look at the...
I've never heard a male
and the guys kind of had a little excuse.
And yet, if you look at the three most prominent, successful leaders of Britain in the last 1,000 years, three of them, probably the top three are, you know, Queen Elizabeth I, Queen Elizabeth II, Victoria, and Margaret Thatcher. You know, if you had to look in the nation's history, who's moulded it, it's actually four women who've done more than probably most of them.
And men hated them because they behaved like men. And they behaved like really strong men.
There is something visceral in that, I suppose. But how many songs, especially in the 80s, how many protest songs against Margaret Thatcher were written, sung and recorded and made it to the charts?
Yeah, and look at Ghost Town. And that's why I look at these, they're not riots at the moment. They're pockets of people getting together, drinking and, to my mind, looking like they're just having quite a laugh. They're getting together and playing music, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. If you look back to the footage of, and I was very young when this happened, if you look at the Brixton riots, you know, Ghost Town and all of that, these were proper, serious manifestations of civil unrest because there was a conflict between half of the nation and the person in control. And I think that was a hugely significant time. We're not getting that now.
No, if you look back at the footage of the miners' strikes, that was
just... No, I mean, I was a student in Yorkshire at exactly this time, and I remember this being a huge event in people's lives, and the animosity, the promises that people made to remember this for as long as they were alive, and to show disrespect when she died. So that has been carried out, but I think it may well be overblown.
But you're not also aware that at that same time, among the working classes, they were sick of the unions the way they were, because we were living, and I was around, we were living this pretty bad life where, you know, people, you know, there were 30 million working days lost every year. You know, the lights were out all the time, it was cold, there was rubbish everywhere. I think the working classes were sick of the power the unions had.
Maybe so. That's a difficult one to go back and reanalyse. Let's take a break for now. Carol and Stig, pick up with you in a second. Coming up, we're